just to gauge this audience, has anybody heard of SBOMs before? That's more than I expected. That's good. For those of you who haven't, don't worry, I'll try and describe what an SBOM is. And so at the end of this talk, hopefully you're going to want to use SBOMs because they're going to be part of your development life cycle, an important part of your life cycle going forward. Want to start? Who remembers this? And how many had sleepless nights? So when you were asked by your CISO or your dev manager, can we fix it? Will you say, yeah, no problem, give me 10 minutes? Or was it more likely, where am I going to start? How do I find out whether I'm using Log4j in all my software? And how do I tell my customers in 24 hours? Wouldn't it be wonderful if you were able to do that? That's what I'm going to try and tell you today. Quick introduction to what I am, or who I am. I've had a transformation in 3 months. I sort of retired 9 months ago after 40 years in the industry delivering complex systems. I then went to OWASP March and to Dish, and I'm now part of the accelerator program in Dish with a few colleagues here. So world can transform very quickly in cyber. I also do quite a lot of outreach work, so I'm familiar with this building because Code Dojo Manchester's upstairs. I'm doing GSOC, I'm part of the Python Software Foundation as part of the GSOC, so I was mentoring a couple of Indian students this afternoon. I also do a bit of running, so if anyone does anything like park runs or cross country, you might bump into me. Or more likely I won't see you because you'll be ahead of me. So what I want to do is now introduce what an SBOM is, and I'm going to use this by an analogy. And I wish I'd known what we were going to have tonight, but if you're going to have a burger, do you know what's inside that burger? How's it being constructed? Do you know all the ingredients of that burger? Because whenever we go to a restaurant, you say, anyone got any allergies? And then actually, when you actually look at it, when you McDonald's or whatever are putting a burger together, there's a whole set of ingredients there, come from a supply chain, come from a greengrocers. Maybe you've got mayonnaise. Where's that mayonnaise come from? What's that mayonnaise composed of? Are you allergic to any of those? Do you know where? Can you understand the pedigree of those ingredients? So hopefully everyone's enjoyed the food tonight. There's no allergies. But think about software. The allergy of a software is built of components, frameworks, libraries, other applications. Those are your ingredients. I'm allergic to vulnerabilities. And actually businesses are really worried about the reaction of a vulnerability, which let's call that an exploit. So if you don't know what's in your software, you don't know what the risk of that using that software is to your organisation or the users of that software, your customers. And it goes all the way down. So although you've got your mayonnaise, it's the ingredients of that mayonnaise. Did it come from Hellman's or was it somebody else? Do you know where your software's come from? Do you know all that supply chain? So SBOMs are all about improving that transparency. So you understand where all your software's come from and you are content to use that software and you understand the risks that anybody's using. So SBOMs are all about risk. So the definition, and this is trying to sort of put it in a context, so if you were sharing this with management, you could understand. This is the one slide. It's machine readable. It's generated by software. Hopefully understand what that software is. But it's intended to be used and consumed by other software. So that's why it's a formal set of formal standards. And you should be sharing it within your teams and with your customers. We'll see that in a minute. But it's part of your risk, and you should all be doing software risk management and software risk assessment as part of your day-to-day development or delivery process. If you don't know the risks, if you don't know what's inside your software, you don't know what the risks are, And how are you as a business able to understand the risk that you're being exposed to? Because you don't want somebody phoning up and saying, I've just been hacked, which is probably what BA are doing and BBC doing and Boots and all the other ones that have been hacked. We'll move it to this week. Okay? So, and there are two big standards. One of them is an OWASP standard, which is Cyclone DX, and that is probably just over 5 years old. And that is a very active and typical OWASP, very agile development in terms of evolving the standard, and you'll see that standard has evolved quite significantly beyond software now. And then in the other corner, I was going to say, the red and the blue corner, over the far side, is SPDX, which comes from the Linux Foundation. And that came from the open source world looking at license management. Still an important part of software bill of materials, but it's come from the licensing, understanding the licenses of all your open source components. And that's a big risk for many organisations. And this, although they are both actively developed, and SPDX is an ISO standard for those who like ISO standards, you can exchange data, although each of them has their own nuances as well, which you'd expect that with any open standard. So the Cyclone DX one, very active, and we'll see that later on. Why's that not done? Okay, but regardless of the standard, an SBOM consists of 3 components. First of all, it's a bit of metadata, which defines things like what's the version of the standard, when was it produced, really important, when are you producing this document, it's a moment in time of your build, of your delivery. You've then got the list of components. Those components could be files, they could be binaries, they could be archives, they could be anything that you are delivering or using. And then you've got the relationships, and the relationships is quite important because that allows you to look at things like change. So if you change a library, a version of the library, you can see which of those applications are impacted. So you can control the impact of change, which then obviously helps your velocity of change in terms of re-release, etc. And the type of metadata I'm looking for a component, its name. We'll talk about a bit of some of the challenges we have about naming later. The version, really important. What's that version? And can you identify your component uniquely by that version? Where's it come from? The supplier. Was it Hellman's mayonnaise or was it unannounced mayonnaise? We need to know exactly where the software has come from. Who is maintaining it? So if there's a problem, you know how to contact that supplier to if there's a defect required. And finally, licenses. Still an important part. It's an important part of risk management for many large organisations. They don't want to get sued because they're using the GPL in the wrong way. And people, the larger the company, the greater the chance that people are going to go after you because they'll get more money. So, why is all the interest in SBOMs? Who remembers SolarWinds? Yeah, the US government didn't like it either, okay? Because I'm sure you guys either make a lot of money out of fixing it or basically worrying customers. SolarWinds really shook the US market. And when President Biden came on in May 2021, I know we were all busy doing other things with COVID, he put out an exec order 14028, which is saying we need to improve the cybersecurity strategy of the US government. For any government-based systems, we need to improve the cybersecurity. And there's a lot of American government systems.
Most are insecure anyway.
Most are insecure, probably, yes. But he wanted to make sure they had better understanding. So he tasked various government agencies to look at how they could do that. And one of the things they suggested was we need to increase the transparency, and software bill of materials was identified as we need to use to publish software bill of materials for every component delivered to the federal government. That was the goal. And they had been looking at this for a few years, and they just said, we've had enough, we're going to go with this. And people were tasked in 60 days from that May deadline we need to say does a good SBOM look like in terms of what's the minimum set of requirements we need for an SBOM. 60 days. And then then over time, then start adopting it, and we'll see where they're going to got to in adoption in a minute. Then Log4j happened, which is a little bit interesting because if they'd have had the SBOMs, Log4j wouldn't have cost the thousands of hours of engineer time looking for this needle in the haystack. I'm sure I've seen some ridiculous statistics how much effort some organisations spent looking for were they affected and responding to their customers because it was Log4j in their component. And I'm not saying it wasn't directly, it was indirectly, but they didn't know that at the time. So in January 2022, the Googles and the Facebooks and Amazons and Microsofts in the world, etc., got summoned to the White House and says, what are you going to do about it? We can't have a Log4j, we've had SolarWinds, we've had Log4j, what are you going to do about it? So they formed the OpenSSF, which is the Open Source Security Foundation, with a job of actually how we can make open source more secure. They saw open source as a potential risk in this area. Or maybe unfairly, but maybe it was just something they could access quickly. So in May, they launched 10 work streams, of which one was Make SBOM Everywhere. And that followed on a report that Linux Foundation had done, following the exec order that says, okay, you've had 9 months, are you aware of the exec order requirements? And some organisation, mainly in the US, was saying, yeah, we're aware of it. Some of them were starting to think about producing it, but not really. So SBOM Everywhere was to try and accelerate that momentum. More training, more tooling. And to be honest, the tooling is awful. The tooling is not consistent and it's not good. Then the Europeans decided to have a go, and they came up with the Cyber Resilience Act. Totally different to the exec order, and being European in the EU, it is really bureaucratic, and they've tried to say, well, we need to deliver software building materials for all software, whether it's open source or not, and we need to support it for vulnerabilities and support it for N years, etc. I have absolutely no idea whether it's achievable. Most people in the open source foundations have said we need to talk because it's not achievable, and if it does, it could kill open source. And if you think about it, all of you are using open source. Every organisation uses open source. Every innovation program uses open source. But they do want SBOMs, which is good for me. UK came out with a consultation in February, just finished, looking at how do we do it in the UK. Similar things to what the CRA is, looking at software being more resilient. Again, they're looking at open source. Again, they're looking at SBOMs potentially as a mechanism for keeping track of that. And then we look at the Federal Drug Agency in the US. October the 1st, every medical device sold in the US has to have a cybersecurity checklist. They have to deliver an SBOM with every medical device. And every medical device needs to have a vulnerability scan performed on it. That's not being done at the moment. I don't think that will be done on the 1st of October personally, because I think, although it's a very laudable aim, and it's being sort of suggested for 4 or 5 years that they do that, I don't think they'll achieve that because they haven't got the level of detail of how the software's been constructed to date. And it'll take a long time to get the level of detail they need to satisfy what the FDA is. I expect the FDA will have to sort of release some of their constraints.
Question for you, Anthony, there. Do you think that they won't get there because organisations are deliberately avoiding it because they know they haven't met all of the licensing requirements for what they do? Putting you on the spot.
I think what they don't realise is they don't know where to start. I think because their supply chain is A lot of the medical devices are small embedded devices, and they are legacy devices, and they haven't got the level of detail, and they've got to go down to the supply chain. Well, we've got 10,000 units, we bought them, we'll use them till we haven't got anything left in the stock. It's not going to change, it's just a baseline.
So we're talking a pacemaker that was made years ago.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a lot of this is embedded devices. One of the things that I've spoken to someone from Mayo Clinic, which is one of the large healthcare providers in the US, and the requirement was any device that was internet connected. Now, most pacemakers are not connected. Well, pacemakers is probably a bad example, but let's say a heart monitor you have in an A&E department. It's on a network, probably the local LAN, but that LAN is then connected to the corporate network and then out to the internet. So there is a potential path. So according to the FDA, that is an internet connected heart monitor. But it's not, because it's got, as we sign up for people, we've got protections and controls. So if this happens in the FDA, and I can see it happening in other regulated industries like automotive, it's starting to happen in things like defence, it's starting to happen in aerospace as well to some extent. This will be coming this way. Or if you are selling to the US, you probably need to start thinking whether you are doing this and how you can apply it. Now, I think it's good things. If you get familiar to do it, you're going to get a step up on your competition. So, SBOMs that are used throughout the life cycle, the development life cycle. So, I've just identified a number of potential use cases there. When I was running a development team, I wouldn't let anybody use a third-party component until they've done an assessment of that third party. And one of those assessments was, did I have a valuable license? If I couldn't identify the license, I would not allow it in the build, because it's exposing me to a risk. You could be doing this as, have it got a reasonable amount of security? Is it keeping up to date with security updates, etc.? Is it currently supported? So those are the sort of things you can start doing. Once you've got the level of detail, you can start doing various interrogations. So you can see the sort of things to do that. How was the build constructed? What were the compilers you used? What was the build tools? License compliance is still a very important thing, but looking at change through the later parts of the life cycle, what's changed? Were you expecting the component version to change? Have you just downloaded the latest version of Node.js? Did you expect to download it? Or was it just, have you just pull latest all the time? Is that what you want? So you can do these sort of things now, which I think is good to help you secure your development and actually be in control. Obsolete software detection is a particular thing that I think is not done by many development teams. So I think we need to start looking at that, because support of software for security, if it's obsolete, you're not going to get security fixes. People want security fixes. And it's used by people other than dev. Your CISOs and your governance people should be looking at this. And you should also be getting it through your supply chain. So as a supplier, you do your little open source component in your garage or your bedroom or wherever. That might get sucked into a distribution, maybe a Red Hat, which then gets put to an integrator, which then delivers to an end customer. You need to be getting those sorts of level of understanding of that supply chain. So I can talk about producers and consumers, and I want everyone to become a consumer of SBOMs, because that's where you're going to get an insight into your software that you don't currently have. But there's lots of tools. So OWASP is really good. Cyclone DX has a tool centre. You can see it on there. And there are probably 200 tools now. It was when I did this last week, it was 100 and whatever. Lots of open source tools, really good. You'll see a few of my tools in there. But you'll also see some commercial tools as well. The one thing I'm going to mention several times, all tools need to be evaluated. Not all SBOMs are the same. You need to, you get what you get, so evaluate it carefully. Run your SBOM, some of the SBOM tools on the same Docker container, you will get different answers. Might not be, and I can't necessarily say which is the right one, but you will just need to be aware of that. And that's the maturity of the tool centre, of the tools at the moment. It will mature, but that's where we are on the market. So when the SBOM Everywhere initiation 12 months ago, that's why we haven't got consistency, we haven't got the maturity of the tools yet. But SBOMs also have a life cycle as well. So regardless of where you are in the development life cycle, your SBOM has a life cycle as well. So the first thing you do is generate. And you can generate at different parts of the life cycle, whether it's source files or whether it's a build images. So the sort of things you're going to get, and this is why I'm not doing live demos, and this is here's one I prepared earlier. And you'll see the old Python things, and I know most of them are mine, so the bugs are mine. The sort of things you're going to get from a file, and because you can see this close on the screen, you're going to see the name of the file, you're going to see different checksums, and that's important for the integrity. Integrity of the build is important. You want to assure that through the whole of your build chain. If you're any forensics of analysis, you want to say, did that build get modified? You also want to see the type of file. Is it a text file? Is it a binary, etc.? This is just simply, it's a source file, it's a Python file. Is there a license in there? I'm big for ensuring that license information and copyright information is in every file. So your QA people should, that's the sort of thing QA people should be picking up on. And, okay, bit of comments. My tools have said I've automatically generated it. It gives a bit of justification, it's my tool, so if the tool's wrong, well, okay, we know it's wrong. If it's been manually generated, well, put a comment in. It gives you an audit. But then you could then get, okay, the next stage, okay, I've built one, built a module, Python module, got the version, 0.22. I've got who's supplier, me, with details, name and email address, so they're contactable. Where can I download it from? Dodgysite.com? No, I'd rather come from a assured ecosystem. Okay, PyPy's had problems the last few weeks, but actually, at least it's an ecosystem that I can go back to. Yeah? Getting a license should be changed. I couldn't determine the copyright from the binary or the build. Maybe that's because the metadata doesn't have that. Some ecosystems do. And then a few other ways. Talked about supply naming. There's a real issue, and there's so many different ways of identifying components. And there are different ways, so CPE is what is often used to identify a component, version, supplier, and the product name. There's other things called PURLs, which is package URLs, which is trying to identify, well, it's come from a repository like a Maven or a PyPy or a NuGet or whatever. We need to be consistent. Tools actually these days may only use one of them, but if you can provide multiple ways of identifying a component, that will help the tooling. And license naming. There is a license, most open source licenses have an identifier that should be used. It's defined by the SPDX community. That was why they started SBOMs in 2011, because they wanted to have consistency of licenses. So don't just say GPL, just say GPL 3 or 3 plus. Be really precise, and there are, I think at the last count, about 350 different ways of specifying your licenses zone. I looked at Apache and I found 7 different ways of doing Apache 2. That's the only one you should be using, Apache-2.0, not Apache space 2. Yes? So if you are producing any metadata for any ecosystem, be precise, and be accurate. And just to say the quality of tools, they were starting to get some metrics and quality tools, and Trivy and Sift both look at Docker containers. And there are various quality metrics being done. And in that case, Sift is slightly better than Trivy. That could be because it's including more parameters. Some of these down the bottom, one's a GitHub one and actually improved. That was in the 5s a few weeks ago. So there is a constant evolution. It's a bit embarrassing when there's one on the top left is the best one, and that's mine. But that's because I started looking at what the parameters were that they wanted to do, and by providing more information, that allows people to use it and get more information out of the build. So I've generated one. Relatively simply, CICD Pipeline, quite simple. There's lots of tools. But then you want to say, okay, let's look at what I've produced. Because what I see so many is people just generate and say, job's done. That's the start of the job. You haven't really started. So let's look at analysis. What's changed since the last time I ran an SBOM? Maybe the versions of some of the modules have changed. That's quite a good check. Are you expecting those changes? Did you really approve those changes? I'm a stickler for actually having baselines and doing change, control change. This allows you to detect, is there any change, is there expected change? Okay? You could just quite easily go through that and justify, yeah, the reason I've gone from, whichever one is in, request from 2.30 to 2.31, yeah, there was a bug fix. We've taken the latest version of the security fix. Great, that's a nice justification to give to your QA people to say why we've changed. Might want to see if licenses have changed. Might see if adding new components have come, or components have disappeared. All good simple checks. But you also want to say, are we using the latest versions of the components? Are we missing any data? That's quite important. US government identified 7 bits of information they wanted for every component. Most of those SBOMs I see do not meet that minimum requirement yet because they haven't got some of that metadata. It'll get better when people start realising what they have to do because they won't be able to get the sign off. I'm involved in an open source project, and we had a pull request for someone to remove one of the checks that he was failing. And we said the whole purpose of the check was to identify what you had to go and do, not to change our software to stop the check, so that you pass your QA test. Okay? So it shows it was starting to work and having a behavioural change. You might want to see your hierarchy, how your components are there. So in this thing, red is your module, the blue is your direct dependencies, the green one is an indirect dependency that I'm pulling in that some of the other modules are pulling in. That's where Log4j was for a lot of people, hidden. That's a more typical way. That's the Firefox browser. And I can't read it, even if I zoom it up to whatever. Yeah, that's your more typical application. Any one of those components could be hiding a risk. Your adversaries know that. If I can do this, I'm sure the adversaries can do it and probably make it far prettier than I can. That might be their way into your system. Not everyone is fluent in reading JSON or XML or YAML or whatever. So you need a way of producing an SBOM in a human readable format so you can give it to your governance people. Very quickly they can see like, all the licenses. Are those licenses what we expect? Maybe we have a policy not to use GPL3. This will very easily show that bit of documentation could give you that checklist very quickly. But finally, this is what you really needed for Log4j. You needed a repository of SBOMs. So if you put all your SBOMs in a repository, let's call it a database, and then you do some queries, then you can find out, are all my SBOMs, what versions of a component are we using? And the example I'm using is PyYAML in there just because I just happen to have some code available. And you can see the different versions in there. There may be good reasons why I've got different versions. You may have different customers with different support contracts, where one has an old version or another. The bottom line is what you really wanted. Was I using Log4j? That would have given you the thumbs up. If you could have done that, happy days. That's what's missing, and that's what you need to have in an organisation. And that's what consumers of SBOMs need to have. Customers should have this. So we've now done that, we've done a bit of analysis. The next stage is, one of the things you want to do maybe is start prioritising some of the defects you found, or do a vulnerability scan. So let's introduce you to another OWASP flagship project, dependency track. I think Simon mentioned it was about 3.5 million a month. That's 300 million. Probably because it's in the CICD pipeline. A lot of people are doing this as part of the CICD pipeline. It takes a Cyclone DX, SBOM, in as its input, and using various data sources, and does analysis of the vulnerabilities and allows you to prioritise your vulnerabilities according to different thresholds and different criteria. So if you look at the top there, you've got different data sources. The NVD is a National Vulnerability Database. It's not really national because it's in the US, but everybody uses it, so really it's a global vulnerability database. OSV is an open source one that Google provide. There are other data sources. You need to have more than one data source to actually look at your vulnerabilities, because there is not one data source that has everything. NVD has some proprietary information as well. You then need to score your vulnerabilities. The common one is CVSS, which probably many of you may have come across before, and you often see criteria. I don't want any vulnerabilities above high or critical, I need them all fixed. That's from the CVSS score. Unfortunately, that looks nothing about whether that vulnerability is real. Is it exploitable or not? So the industry is now starting to move to EPSS, which is an exploitability scoring system, and that will identify that 95% of most vulnerabilities are not exploitable in the wild. That's good. That reduces your workload. You need to look at how many of the vulnerabilities are actually known as exploits. So this is what's known as the KEV list, which is maintained by the US. Mr. Microsoft is the top of those at the moment, and not surprisingly, because of all the things, Microsoft is everywhere. That's why people exploit it, try and exploit it. So are those things in your data? And then there are things about vulnerabilities, and we'll see this in a bit later. But there are different ways of saying, okay, I've done this scan. These are the vulnerabilities that the scan says. Actually, I want to say triage them and say no, they're not really viable because the referencing may be a function in a library, and I don't use that function. So therefore, I can't be exploited. So VEX is one way of defining it, which is a vulnerability exploited. It's a negative saying it can't be exploited. VDR is a disclosure to say these are all the vulnerabilities I'm aware of. And then CSAF is one of the problems. There's multiple standards at the moment evolving in this area. CSAF is just a big standard that I don't see many people using at the moment, but it'll maybe come change. And that's identifying vulnerabilities against products. And then the fun stage starts. You've worked out what you've got to fix, then you go and fix it. That's when most of the dev people get excited, and that's when you trigger your normal dev cycle. And if you change your baseline, you start again. New SBOM. SBOM changes every time you change your build, you've got a new SBOM. And you just go around that loop again. So this is a continuous process. It's not a one-off, it's not an audit, it's something you're doing continually all the time. And everyone's involved. So you see stuff should be happy, I've got a process that's in control, your build team, your governance people, your product team, your dev team. Talk about sharing it amongst your organisation. That's why it's important. You have a way of looking at an SBOM such that the SBOM is understandable by all those different users and communities. The one thing that CICD does and OWASP have done is recognise that software doesn't lie in isolation. Software needs other things like hardware. And increasingly software works with cloud services, software as a service. So SBOMs are now becoming what I'll call XBOMs. Put another letter in front of the bomb. So you've got HBOM for hardware. OBOM, which is the operation, which is like your build of all the hardware and all your software, because you'll have multiple SBOMs. And they're going to see more and more coming in. There's one for machine learning, because that's going to look at the data that's gone into your LLMs. So I presume that's probably what we saw at the beginning. What's the data in? What's the training data? What's the provenance of that data, etc.? Where's it come from, etc. So you see, it's evolving. And some of this is coming from some rather large organisations. So the SBOM stuff is coming from IBM. There's an architecture one. I think people like Siemens or Lockheed are heavily involved in this as well. There's some big organisations now recognising they need this level of visibility and transparency for everything they're producing. And SBOMs doesn't really live in isolation in terms of the whole of the supply chain. So you're looking at, have you got trust in where the data is coming from? And 6-score is now one of the standards that seems to be being pushed. And then you've got, at the top there, you've got software supply chain in terms of your maturity of your supply chain, in terms of your process. And then you've got your VEX in terms of the vulnerabilities. So you need to start having a more joined up supply chain and showing all these things working together. So are we now thumbs up? Or are we still head in the stands? I don't know, no. Okay, there's a lot there. I fully realise there's a lot there. But hopefully you can see why, hopefully that's going to become less obvious when you get a CISO ask you, when I've got log5j, you're going to say, give me 5 minutes, here's the answer. So to summarise, SBOMs are now a really important part of your development lifecycle. They're just starting to become mainstream in parts of the States. We should start seeing on GitHub increasing amounts of releases of software with an SBOM associated with it. There's a few projects starting to do that, but that should become the norm. That's good. If the open source community is to get the transparency that's required, that's going to be a good thing for everybody. We need that dependency so we can understand the impact of change better. And we also need to recognise software risk management is a really important part of anything we're delivering. But remember, and we all know this in software, garbage in, garbage out. So the data that an SBOM needs relies on the community and the development teams. So if you are putting any data in any software component, make sure it's right and as accurate as complete as possible. I'm sure many of you work in open source, contribute to open source projects, make it better. So yeah, I'm still at Dish for a few more weeks. Contact me on various things. You can see my GitHub repository and you can make comments about my software. I would love constructive requests for new features, because I've only been able to touch on some of the features I've got. But what do you need to make SBOM work for you? It won't surprise you that my business model, my startup, is all about SBOMs and business software risk management, but that's why you can probably see why I think it's an important part for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Yeah, I can see that being a, whether we like it or not, we end up following the American regulations time and again. And I can see that coming in around PCI and GDPR and all sorts of aspects to demonstrate that you've got the right software doing the right things. So that concludes our talks for today. Has anyone got any other questions for Anthony at this point? Okay.
Yeah. So at the end you sounded quite optimistic in terms of saying you're seeing companies doing it, you think it's getting better. But at the start you're talking about how, like, for American healthcare, which seems a pretty big sector and quite important, they were dragging their feet. So how well do you think it's going overall, and what's the kind of final state you think will kind of, because presumably people aren't always going to do it, so we'll probably reach an equilibrium of some people not doing it and a lot of big companies doing it. So you can't probably express as a percentage, but where do you think we'll get to and how well is it going?
Okay, so the question is about how well do you think we're going to get as an industry in terms of SBOMs? I'm seeing some rather large organisations starting to get worried. I mentioned Lockheed, I mentioned Siemens. They now have those as part of their life cycle, SBOMs. Not mandated, but they are recognising they need to have that level of control internally, just in case a Log4j comes along again. I think my personal view is the regulated industries are probably going to be the first ones, which is why healthcare, medical devices is really strongly regulated. I would expect aerospace and defence, where there's anything safety, I would expect some of the things like control systems, nuclear, SCADA systems that used to work in. I can see those. I didn't think financial services would be, but I've been told, a good friend of mine, they are using SBOMs extensively in the financial markets because they see that as the risk of understanding the risk of vulnerabilities impacting their solutions. In terms of they want that transparency so they can protect their infrastructures. So I think a lot of it will happen by the inspired organisations initially. And so it's, your hype curve, so you'll have the early adopters. I think we're some way off where it becomes business as normal, totally agree. But I think there will be a sea change, hopefully in the next few years.
Which do you think the most important industries are that start adopting this? So you mentioned SCADA and ICS stuff there, for instance, seems a fairly critical one to get on board, but also probably one of the ones that would have the hardest time doing it, given the amount of legacy kit there. Whereas financial services and banks and things like that would probably have a much easier time doing it. Hence, I guess why you're saying there's more adoption there and they're more heavily regulated and stuff. What would be your guide of the ones that seem the most critical to get their shit together soon?
So the question is, which industries do you think are most critical to start adopting SBOMs? I agree with the legacy problem. Let's leave the legacy problem to one side. Because let's just say that's history. Let's get future sorted out first. So, and you're right, legacy systems in SCADA is really hard because there's lots of legacy systems out. I think the regulated industries, though I would think if those of you familiar with things like NIS, which is the national infrastructure, things that EU push, so the critical industries like energy, utilities, media, water, the essential services, I think are the ones which I think are going to probably require it first. But let's put it right, open source will be one of them, and other unit, so if it's in open source, it applies everywhere.
If I can respond on that one as well, I think it's a bit of a sticking your head in the sand to think that for the OT area that they'll ignore it. If you go through and you calculate a hash value, you at least know what it is now. Then you can tell if someone's changed it. And integrity of the software changes to things. We saw a number of attempted intrusions against the entire supply chain during the development of the COVID vaccine from some very capable nation-state actors to do simple things like change the amounts that were being put into various chemical processes to make the vaccines. If you can develop a soft SBOM around that recipe that the OT is coded with, you can start to address that risk. The other aspect I think of is the Chinese proverb of when is the best time to plant a tree? Yesterday. If not, you do it today. Any further questions? Okay, it seems like we have come to the end of our time. Thank you all very much. I think that's actually my phone telling me as much. Quick shout out to anyone who would like to think about submitting a talk for the next session. If anyone's got any ideas, that would be great. Feel free to find one of us in the t-shirts and talk about potential ideas. Anything you've considered, is this something you'd want to bring to a talk? We can talk that over a beer or whatever later on. Most of us are going to be wandering over to Hatch later on for a beer, so otherwise thank you very much for coming, and thank you again to Anthony. Cheers all, and thanks to our sponsors. Thank you very much.